Richard, please don't leave us here. Diane's voice trembled, her tears mixing with the cold wind as she clutched her three newborns tightly against her chest. She watched helplessly as her husband avoided her eyes, slammed the car door, and started the engine. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered, his voice flat and distant. The car tires rolled over the gravel, disappearing into the distance, leaving her stranded in the freezing wilderness alone, vulnerable, and with three tiny lives depending on her. Stay with African Legacy Tales to uncover the shocking truth behind his betrayal, and before we begin, let me know in the comments where are you listening to me from today. The sound of car tires crunching against gravel faded into the distance as Diane Maxwell stood trembling in the growing darkness, clutching her three newborn babies to her chest. The late autumn wind whipped through the trees of the Appalachian forest, and her thin hospital gown offered little protection against the biting cold. Just hours earlier, what should have been the happiest day of her life, the birth of her triplets, had turned into a nightmare when her husband Richard drove her and their newborns to this remote location and left them to die. "I can't handle this responsibility," were his last cold words before driving away, leaving his wife and three innocent babies alone in the wilderness miles from the nearest town. The babies, barely 2 days old, began to whimper in unison, their tiny faces scrunching up against the harsh wind. Diane's legs wobbled beneath her as the reality of her situation sank in. She was weakened from the cesarean delivery, with surgical stitches still fresh, and now faced with the unthinkable task of saving not just herself but her three precious newborns. Can a mother's love conquer a deadly betrayal? The sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. She needed to find shelter and fast. Through her tears, Diane forced herself to focus on her nursing training. Before marriage had derailed her career, she had nearly completed her degree in emergency medicine. "Think, Diane, think," she whispered to herself, trying to slow her racing heart. The babies needed warmth first. Hypothermia could kill them within hours. She carefully tucked the triplets, 2 girls and a boy, inside her hospital gown, using her body heat to keep them warm. The stitches from her C-section pulled painfully with every movement, but maternal instinct drove her forward. She remembered reading about survival situations during her training: find shelter, build a fire, locate water. These basics could mean the difference between life and death. As darkness descended, Diane spotted what looked like an old hunting cabin through the trees. Her heart leaped with hope, even as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Each step was agony, but the soft breathing of her babies against her chest gave her the strength to continue. What Diane didn't know, as she struggled toward that cabin, was that this moment of apparent abandonment would set in motion a chain of events that would dramatically transform not only her life but the lives of her children. And somewhere in the city, Richard Maxwell was about to make a phone call that would reveal the true depths of his betrayal and the real reason he had left his family to die in the wilderness. The cabin grew closer, its dark windows revealing nothing of what waited inside. Diane's medical training told her she had perhaps hours before her weakened condition and the cold became life-threatening. As she reached for the cabin's door handle, a sound in the darkness behind her made her freeze. She wasn't alone in these woods after all. In that moment, as fear gripped her heart, Diane made a silent promise to her babies: "We're going to survive this, and one day your father will regret what he's done." She had no way of knowing just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The sound that had frozen Diane in her tracks came again, footsteps crunching through fallen leaves. Her arms tightened protectively around her babies as a beam of light cut through the darkness. A woman's voice called out, "Hello, is someone there?" Diane's knees nearly buckled with relief when an elderly woman emerged from the shadows, holding a flashlight. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite the late hour, she wore sturdy hiking boots and a warm jacket. "Oh my God," the woman gasped, taking in Diane's hospital gown and the tiny bundles she carried. "I'm Fabiana Scott. I live just down the hill. I saw headlights up here and came to investigate." The next few hours passed in a blur as Fabiana took charge of the situation. Her home, a comfortable cottage equipped with a generator and well-stocked pantry, became a sanctuary for Diane and her newborns. As Fabiana helped settle the babies in makeshift bassinets crafted from dresser drawers lined with soft blankets, Diane learned that her savior was a retired obstetric nurse who had moved to these woods after her husband's death. "It wasn't chance that brought me to you tonight," Fabiana said firmly as she checked the baby's vital signs. "I've delivered hundreds of babies in my career, but finding 3 newborns and their mother in these woods, someone up there must be watching over you." As Diane lay on Fabiana's guest bed, her babies finally warm and fed, the full story of her relationship with Richard began to emerge. They had met 3 years ago when Diane was in her final year of nursing school. Richard Maxwell, 15 years her senior, had seemed like everything she wanted: successful, charming, and eager to start a family. Their whirlwind romance led to marriage within 6 months, and Diane had put her studies on hold at Richard's insistence. The changes were so gradual, Diane explained, her voice hollow. First he convinced me to quit school, then he moved us to a new city away from my friends and family. When I got pregnant, he seemed happy at first, but when we learned it was triplets, she trailed off, remembering the dark look that had crossed his face during the ultrasound. Fabiana's expression grew troubled as she listened. Diane, I need to ask you something. The hospital, they must be looking for you and the babies. Did Richard check you out properly, or did he just take you? The question hit Diane like a physical blow. In her shock and fear, she hadn't even considered the implications. He said he'd handled all the paperwork, but now that I think about it, I never signed anything. The nurses were changing shifts, and he just wheeled me out. Oh God, he kidnapped us. Fabiana's face hardened with determination. Then we need to be very careful about what we do next. If Richard took you without proper discharge, he's committed a serious crime. But that also means, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, Diane, I think there's more to this than just a man overwhelmed by the prospect of triplets. Have you ever looked into Richard's past, his previous relationships? Before Diane could respond, her son, the smallest of the triplets, began to wail. As she moved to comfort him, Fabiana walked to her phone, then stopped. The storm that's moving in will probably knock out the line soon, but first thing tomorrow I'm calling an old friend at the sheriff's department. Something tells me Richard Maxwell isn't just running from responsibility, he's running from something much darker. That night, as a fierce storm raged outside, Diane lay awake watching her sleeping babies. She had named them in the quiet hours, Jean, Faith, and Christopher, but as thunder rattled the windows and lightning illuminated the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this temporary haven wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably realizing that his plan had failed, and Diane had been married to him long enough to know one thing with absolute certainty: her husband would not leave loose ends. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, in a dimly lit office 60 miles away, Richard Maxwell was indeed making plans. But as he opened a hidden safe behind his desk and removed a thick file labeled Project Legacy, his hands trembled with fear rather than anger, because Richard Maxwell had his own secrets, and the birth of the triplets had set in motion events that threatened to expose them all. The storm intensified, and somewhere in the darkness, a car's headlights appeared on the distant road, moving slowly despite the weather, searching. Dawn broke over Fabiana's cottage, revealing a landscape transformed by the night storm. Fallen branches littered the ground, and the dirt road leading to the property had turned to mud. Diane sat at the kitchen window, cradling Jean, while Fabiana prepared formula for the triplets. The elderly nurse had proven to be a godsend, showing Diane how to care for 3 newborns simultaneously, a challenge that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours ago. The peaceful morning shattered when Fabiana's ancient radio crackled to life with a local news bulletin. Police are seeking information regarding the disappearance of Diane Maxwell and her newborn triplets from Memorial Hospital. Mrs. Maxwell, who underwent a cesarean section 2 days ago, was last seen leaving the hospital with her husband, Richard Maxwell. Hospital staff became concerned when routine post-surgical checks revealed unauthorized patient removal. Fabiana switched off the radio, her face grave. The phone lines are still down from the storm, but as soon as they're back up, we need to contact the authorities. Diane, there's something else you should know, she hesitated, then continued. Last night, while you were sleeping, I recognized your husband's name. 15 years ago, I worked at a hospital in Cincinnati. There was a case, a woman named Rebecca Turner. She was married to a Richard Maxwell. Diane's hands began to tremble so badly that Fabiana quickly took Jean from her arms. What happened to her? Rebecca disappeared shortly after giving birth to twins, Fabiana's voice cracked. Richard claimed she had postpartum depression and had abandoned them. The police investigated, but nothing was ever proven. The twins, Fabiana's voice cracked, they were found dead in their cribs 2 weeks later. Sudden infant death syndrome was the official ruling, but many of us had doubts. Richard Maxwell collected a substantial insurance payout and vanished. Diane's world tilted on its axis as pieces began falling into place. Richard's insistence on life insurance policies for both her and the babies, taken out months before their birth, his strange phone calls behind closed doors, the way he had become increasingly controlling and distant as her pregnancy progressed. "The babies," Diane whispered, horror-struck, "he never intended for any of us to survive." "But why? What could be worth?" She was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Through the window, they saw a black SUV pulling up to the cottage. Fabiana quickly moved to the window, then relaxed slightly. "It's just my nephew Louis, he's the sheriff's deputy I mentioned." The man who stepped out of the SUV was in his early 40s, wearing a police uniform and a concerned expression. Fabiana hurried to let him in, but Diane's relief at seeing law enforcement was short-lived. As Louis entered the kitchen, his face was ashen. "Aunt Fabiana, we need to get them out of here now," he said without preamble. "I ran a background check on Richard Maxwell. The man is living under a stolen identity. His real name is Deus Thorne, and he's been linked to multiple cases of insurance fraud and suspicious deaths across 3 states. But that's not the worst part." He turned to Diane, his expression grim. "Mrs. Maxwell, your husband isn't just a con man, he's part of a sophisticated insurance fraud ring. They target wealthy families, particularly those with multiple births, because of the higher policy payouts." Diane sank into a chair, her C-section scar throbbing with the sudden movement. "The fertility treatments," she whispered, "he insisted we use a specific clinic, said it was the best, but it was the only one he would consider." Louis nodded grimly. "The clinic is probably part of the operation. They artificially increase the chances of multiple births, then their associates step in to take advantage of the situation." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "We've been building a case against this organization for years, but they're careful, they make the deaths look natural or accidental, and they have connections in high places." A baby's cry from the other room spurred them into action. As Diane and Fabiana hurried to check on the triplets, Louis' radio crackled. The message made him curse under his breath. "Multiple vehicles spotted heading this way," he reported. "They must have tracked him here somehow. We have maybe 20 minutes. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing. "I'm calling for backup, but in this terrain it'll take them at least 40 minutes to arrive in force." Fabiana was already moving, pulling out an old map and spreading it on the kitchen table. "There's an old Forest Service road out back. It's rough, but my Jeep can handle it. It leads to a ranger station about 15 miles from here." "No good," Louis cut in, "they'll be watching all the obvious escape routes. We need something they won't expect." He turned to Diane, his expression intense. "Mrs. Maxwell, what I'm about to suggest is risky, but it might be our only chance to keep you and your children alive while we gather enough evidence to bring down this entire organization." Before he could continue, headlights appeared on the road leading to the cottage, more than one vehicle, moving fast. In the growing light of dawn, Diane caught a glimpse of a familiar silver sedan among them. Richard had found them. As Fabiana quickly gathered the babies, Louis pulled out his service weapon and handed Diane a sealed envelope. "Everything you need is in here, memorize it, then burn it. If we make it through the next hour, you and your children are going to disappear. The question is, Mrs. Maxwell, how far are you willing to go to protect your babies?" Diane looked down at her sleeping triplets, then back at the approaching headlights. In that moment, she felt something hard and determined settle in her chest. "Whatever it takes," she said firmly, "whatever it takes." The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Fabiana led them through a hidden door in her pantry, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The previous owner was a Prohibition-era bootlegger, she explained hurriedly, helping Diane navigate the steep steps while carefully carrying Faith. "There's a tunnel that comes out near the creek." Louis followed with Jean and Christopher, his police training evident in his steady movements. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside echoed through the cottage above them. "They're here," he whispered. "Fabiana, you know what to do." The elderly nurse nodded grimly, taking one last look at Diane and the babies. "Give me 3 minutes, then go." She ascended the stairs, closing the hidden door behind her. Through the wooden ceiling, they could hear her footsteps moving across the cottage floor. Diane's heart pounded as she heard Fabiana opening the front door above them. Richard Maxwell. Fabiana's voice carried faintly through the floorboards, filled with convincing surprise. What brings the police out here so early, Mrs. Scott? Richard's voice made Diane's blood run cold. We're conducting a search for my wife and children. They've gone missing under concerning circumstances. Given your history as a labor and delivery nurse, we thought you might have some information. Missing. Fabiana's acted confusion was perfect. How terrible, but I don't understand. I've been here all night because of the storm, haven't seen a soul. The conversation continued above as Diane, Louis, and the triplets moved through the tunnel. It was narrow but tall enough to walk upright, supported by old wooden beams. The babies, perhaps sensing the tension, remained remarkably quiet. Diane's C-section incision burned with every step, but she forced herself to keep moving. They had almost reached the tunnel's end when they heard shouting from the cottage. Search everything, Richard's voice commanded. They have to be here somewhere. Now, Louis whispered urgently, we have to move now. They emerged from the tunnel into the gray dawnlight, concealed by thick undergrowth near a swift-moving creek. The sound of the water would help mask any noise from the babies. Louis quickly led them to where he had hidden a second vehicle, an unmarked police SUV with tinted windows. As Louis secured the babies in car seats he'd somehow managed to prepare in advance, Diane's mind raced. Fabiana, will she be okay? My aunt can handle herself, Louis assured her, though his jaw was tight with worry. She's got friends in the state police arriving any minute, but right now we need to focus on getting you and the babies to safety. They were just pulling onto a narrow Forest Service road when Diane's maternal instinct screamed a warning. Wait, she gasped, the hospital bracelet. Richard will have the numbers, he can trace the babies. Louis cursed softly, pulling over. They quickly but carefully removed the hospital ID bracelets from the triplets' tiny ankles. Louis took out his pocket knife and buried them under a large rock. Good thing thinking, he said, those kinds of details can mean the difference between life and death. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, Diane studied Louis's tense profile. You've done this before, haven't you? Helped people escape? He was quiet for a long moment. My sister, he finally said. She was targeted by a different crew, but same basic scheme, multiple births, insurance policies, tragic accident. I was too late to save her and my nieces. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. That's why I started investigating these cases, but these people, they're careful, they have connections in law enforcement, hospitals, insurance companies. Taking them down requires absolute proof, and witnesses rarely survive to testify. A sudden explosion rocked the pre-dawn silence back in the direction of Fabiana's cottage. Diane gasped in horror, but Louis's expression remained grimly focused. That'll be the tunnel, he said. Fabiana would have set the charges once she was sure we were clear. It's what we planned. Planned? Diane's head spun. How long have you been watching Richard Maxwell? About 6 months. We knew he was planning something when he started setting up the insurance policies, but we needed proof. Fabiana's been helping us monitor the situation. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the sleeping babies. We didn't expect triplets. It changed the timeline. They drove in tense silence for several miles before Louis spoke again. The envelope I gave you, have you memorized the contents? Diane nodded. The documents inside had contained a detailed escape plan, new identities, bank accounts, safe houses, and contact protocols. But how did you arrange all this so quickly? We didn't, Louis admitted. This was supposed to be for another case, but when I realized what was happening with you and the triplets, I made some calls, changed some details. The people helping you, let's just say they have their own reasons for wanting to see Richard Maxwell's organization taken down. A sudden movement in the trees ahead made Louis swerve sharply. A black SUV pulled out onto the road behind them, its headlights flaring to life. Diane's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the driver in the rearview mirror. It was Philippe, Richard's longtime business associate. Hold on, Louis ordered, accelerating around a sharp bend, and whatever happens next, remember you have to follow the plan no matter what. The SUV behind them gained ground as the road narrowed. In the back seat, the triplets began to wake, their cries adding to the mounting tension. Diane turned to comfort them, and that's when she saw a second vehicle approaching from a side road ahead, trying to cut them off. Louis's expression hardened as he reached for his radio. This is Deputy Scott. I need immediate backup on Forest Service Road 23. pursuing suspects in the Maxwell case, civilian passengers on board. They're trying to box us in. Static was the only response, they were too far in the mountains for a clear signal. As the road ahead narrowed further, Diane realized they were running out of options. She looked back at her babies, then at the approaching vehicles, and made a decision that would change everything. "Louis," she said, her voice steady despite her terror, "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." Diane's plan was both desperate and brilliant in its simplicity. "The old ranger's cabin," she said quickly, "the one I saw last night, it's just off this road, isn't it? And it connects to the mines." Louis's eyes widened with understanding. "The abandoned copper mines, they're not safe." "Neither is this," Diane cut him off as their pursuers gained ground. "Richard doesn't know I was conscious when he drove me to the forest last night. I heard him talking to Philippe on the phone about their backup location, the ranger's cabin. They must have supplies there, maybe evidence." The SUV behind them rammed their back bumper, making the triplets wail in terror. Louis made a split-second decision, yanking the wheel hard to the right onto a nearly hidden dirt track. "If you're wrong about this, I'm not," Diane said with certainty. "Richard always has a backup plan, he's too careful not to, and he's too arrogant to think I was alert enough to remember anything from last night." The dirt track wound through dense forest before opening onto a small clearing. The ranger's cabin sat there, dark and seemingly abandoned. Louis killed the engine and lights. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they figure out where we turned off. What's your plan?" Diane was already moving, carefully lifting Christopher from his car seat. "They'll expect us to hide in the cabin, but when I was in nursing school, I did a rotation with search and rescue. They taught us about these old mines. They're like mazes, but they all connect to central drainage tunnels. If we can get to the main tunnel, we could come out anywhere in a 15-mile radius." Louis finished catching on as he helped with the other babies. "But Diane, those tunnels are dangerous, cave-ins, bad air." "We don't have to go far," Diane interrupted, her nursing training taking over, "just far enough to make them think we went deeper than we did. Look," she pointed to the side of the cabin where old mining equipment lay scattered among the debris was a mine entrance, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. They had just reached the entrance when headlights swept the clearing. Louis pushed Diane and the babies behind a large piece of equipment as 2 vehicles pulled up. Through a gap in the rusted metal, Diane watched as Richard stepped out of his car, his face illuminated by flashlight beams. "The cabin's been used recently," Philippe called out, examining the building. "Dust patterns are disturbed, let's check inside." Richard ordered, "But be careful, my wife has help, that deputy." He broke off as a baby's whimper carried through the pre-dawn air. Diane's heart nearly stopped, but then she noticed Louis was no longer beside her. A moment later, she heard his voice from inside the cabin. "In here, I need help with the babies." Richard and his men rushed toward the cabin's front door. The instant they were out of sight, Diane clutched her children tight and slipped into the mine entrance. The passage was low and narrow, forcing her to crouch awkwardly, her C-section stitches screaming in protest. The sound of shouting erupted from the cabin behind her. She had only gone about 50 yards when she heard gunshots. Tears sprang to her eyes as she thought of Louis, but she forced herself to keep moving. The babies, perhaps sensing the need for silence, stayed remarkably quiet. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing cooler. Diane's medical training screamed warnings about air quality and structural stability, but she had no choice but to press on. She found a side chamber that felt more stable than the rest and tucked herself and the babies into it, wrapping them in the emergency blankets Louis had given her. More shots echoed through the tunnels, followed by shouting and the sound of running feet. Flashlight beams swept the main passage, but the side chamber remained in shadow. Diane held her breath as Richard's voice carried through the darkness. "Find them, they have to be down here somewhere, the babies can't travel far in these conditions." Diane waited until the flashlight beams and voices had moved deeper into the tunnel system, then, moving as quietly as possible, she began working her way back toward the entrance. It was a risk, but she was betting everything on Richard's predictability. He would assume she'd gone deeper into the mines, not back toward danger. She had almost reached the entrance when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Diane nearly screamed before a familiar voice whispered, "It's me, Louis." She gasped, "But I heard shots." "Fired into the air," he explained quietly, "had to make them think they'd driven me deeper into the mines. but we need to move now. I called in every favor I had. State police are on their way, but we have to get you and the babies out of here first. They emerged from the mine into chaos. Red and blue lights were flashing at the edge of the clearing, and shouts filled the air. But it wasn't state police who had arrived, it was FBI. Federal agents, a voice boomed through a megaphone, the building is surrounded, come out with your hands up. Richard and his men emerged from the mine behind them, guns drawn. Diane found herself face to face with her husband, seeing him clearly for the first time since he'd abandoned her in the forest. But something was different, the confident mask had cracked, revealing naked fear beneath. It's over, Richard, she said quietly, holding her babies close, or should I say Deus, or whatever your real name is? But Richard wasn't looking at her anymore, his eyes were fixed on something behind her, and his face had gone chalk white. Diane turned to see what had frightened him so badly, and her own jaw dropped in shock, because walking toward them through the chaos was a woman she had seen before, but only in old newspaper clippings. Fabiana had shown her. It was Rebecca Turner, Richard's supposedly dead first wife, very much alive and wearing an FBI tactical vest. Time seemed to freeze in the pre-dawn light as Rebecca Turner approached, her tactical vest emblazoned with FBI catching the flashing emergency lights. Diane noticed her graceful movement wasn't that of someone who had been seriously injured. This was a woman who had been trained to handle herself in dangerous situations. Special Agent Rebecca Turner, she announced, her voice carrying across the clearing. Deus, Richard, or whatever you're calling yourself these days, I've been waiting 5 years for this moment. Richard's face contorted with a mix of fury and disbelief. You're dead, he stammered. The twins are alive and well, Rebecca cut him off coldly, living with their grandparents in witness protection while I worked to take down your organization. Did you really think I was just another naive victim? I was already investigating insurance fraud cases when you targeted me. Diane's mind raced as pieces fell into place. She looked at Louis, who nodded grimly. Rebecca was my contact in the FBI, he explained quietly. When I realized what was happening with you and the triplets, she's the one who helped me set up the escape plan. Philippe and the other men began to lower their weapons as more FBI agents emerged from the trees, but Richard's gun remained trained on Diane and the babies. His hands were shaking. You don't understand, he said, his voice cracking, they'll kill me if I don't deliver. The policy's already in place, millions in coverage, they're expecting results. Rebecca pressed, taking another step forward. You mean the people above you in the organization, the ones who've been running this scheme across multiple states? She smiled grimly. We already have them, Deus. While you were out here chasing Diane and her babies, our teams were executing simultaneous raids in 5 cities. The insurance executives, the dirty cops, the fertility clinic staff, they're all in custody. Richard's face went ashen. Diane could see him processing this information, realizing how completely his world was collapsing. But something about his expression made her maternal instincts scream a warning. He's got another gun, she said suddenly, remembering how Richard always carried a backup weapon, ankle holster, right side. The warning came just as Richard dropped his empty primary weapon and reached for his ankle, but Rebecca was faster, closing the distance between them with practiced efficiency. In one smooth movement, she disarmed him and had him face down on the ground, cuffs clicking into place as other agents took custody of Philippe and his men. Diane felt her legs begin to give out. Louis quickly helped her sit on a nearby log, checking on the babies who had remarkably slept through much of the chaos. Rebecca joined them after turning Richard over to her colleagues. Up close, Diane could see the strength and determination in her eyes, but also deep compassion. I am so sorry we couldn't move sooner, she said softly. We needed him to make an overt move to connect all the pieces. When we learned about your pregnancy, we tried to put protective measures in place, but the triplets, she shook her head, it accelerated everything. The fertility clinic, Diane said slowly, they deliberately increased the chances of multiple births. Rebecca nodded grimly, it was part of their scheme. Multiple births meant higher insurance payouts. The clinic would help select vulnerable targets, women whose husbands or partners were actually plants from the organization. They had it down to a science. Diane looked down at her sleeping babies, rage building in her chest at how they had been seen as nothing more than dollar signs to these people. How many families? Too many, Rebecca answered quietly, but you're the first mother we know of who fought back so effectively. Your nursing training, You're quick thinking, she smiled slightly. You did everything right, even without knowing the full picture. That's why Louis contacted me so urgently when he realized what was happening. He recognized that same spirit I had, the determination to not just survive but to turn the tables on them. Just then, Fabiana appeared at the edge of the clearing, escorted by state police. Diane burst into tears of relief at seeing her alive. The elderly nurse rushed to embrace her, checking on the babies with professional efficiency. The tunnel charges were my idea, Fabiana admitted with a hint of pride. Learned a thing or two from my late husband. He was a mining engineer, knew exactly where to place them to seal off the escape route without risking the main structure. As medical teams arrived to check on Diane and the triplets, Rebecca pulled Louis aside for a quiet conversation. Diane couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could read the tension in their body language. Something wasn't over yet. Her suspicion was confirmed when Rebecca turned, her expression serious. Diane, there's something else you need to know, something we found in Richard's office safe during the raids. She hesitated, glancing at the babies. It's about your fertility treatments and some genetic testing the clinic performed without your knowledge. Diane felt her heart skip a beat as she looked at her children. What kind of genetic testing? Rebecca took a deep breath, the kind that revealed something extraordinary about your triplets, something that makes them even more unique than we realized. And unfortunately, there are people still out there who would be very interested in that information. The first rays of sunrise began to paint the sky pink as Diane absorbed this news, holding her babies closer. She had thought the nightmare was over, but apparently this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Looking at Rebecca's face, she knew there were more revelations to come, revelations that would force her to make decisions she never could have imagined just days ago. The medical center's private consultation room felt worlds away from the chaos of the forest. Diane sat in a comfortable chair, her baby sleeping peacefully in a hospital-provided bassinet beside her. Rebecca and Louis were there, along with Dr. Marina Gibson, a genetic specialist who had been working with the FBI task force. The fertility clinic wasn't just helping select targets for insurance fraud, Dr. Gibson explained, spreading out several medical files on the table. They were running an unauthorized genetic screening program, looking for specific genetic markers. When they found them in you, Diane, that's when Richard was assigned to your case. Diane looked at her sleeping children, her protective instincts flaring. What markers? What's so special about my babies? Dr. Gibson's expression softened. Your triplets possess an extremely rare genetic combination that creates natural immunity to several severe autoimmune conditions. It's something we've only seen in a handful of cases worldwide. Their blood cells have unique properties that could potentially revolutionize treatments for conditions like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and certain types of immunodeficiency. The organization wasn't just after insurance money, Rebecca added quietly. They were funding private research, selling information about special cases like yours to pharmaceutical companies through shell corporations. The insurance fraud was just their cover story. Diane's mind reeled as she processed this information. So Richard, he was supposed to get rid of you but preserve the babies? Louis finished grimly. They had a whole network of corrupt medical professionals ready to claim the triplets had miraculously survived whatever accident befell you. They would have ended up in their research program, their true identity erased. Dr. Gibson leaned forward, her voice gentle but urgent. Diane, I want to be very clear about something. Your children's genetic profile is extraordinary, but not supernatural. It's a natural mutation that could help develop new treatments, but through proper, ethical medical research. What that organization was planning, it was about profit, not medicine. What happens now? Diane asked, looking at Rebecca. Are my babies still in danger? The FBI agent nodded slowly. Unfortunately, there are still people out there who would be very interested in your children's genetic profile. The organization's research data has already been sold to multiple parties. While we've seized what we could find, we can't be certain we got everything, which is why we need to discuss your options. Louis added, the Witness Protection Program. No, Diane interrupted firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. I won't spend my life running and hiding. My children deserve better than that. Rebecca smiled slightly, as if she'd expected this response. Actually, we have another proposal. Dr. Gibson, the genetic specialist, pulled out another file. The National Institutes of Health has a special research partnership program. It provides protection and support for families like yours while allowing ethical research that could help countless others. You would have full control over your family's participation, complete transparency about all research activities, and most importantly, you'd be able to live openly, just with enhanced security measures. The best protection is often hiding in plain sight, Rebecca added. With the resources of legitimate medical research institutions behind you, you'd have both security and purpose, plus your nursing background would be invaluable in this setting. Diane looked at her sleeping triplets, Jean, Faith, and Christopher. She thought about everything they'd survived in their first few days of life, the strength they'd shown. They really could help other people? Dr. Gibson nodded. Their genetic profile could lead to breakthroughs in treating diseases that currently have no cure, but, she emphasized, only if and when you choose to participate. You and your children are not research subjects, you're people who deserve to live your lives on your own terms. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Fabiana entered, carrying a tray of coffee cups. The elderly nurse had refused to leave Diane's side, becoming a surrogate grandmother to the triplets. I'm not interrupting, but these little ones will be wanting their next feeding soon. As if on cue, Faith began to stir, making the tiny mewling sound that preceded her hungry cries. Diane lifted her daughter, marveling at how someone so small could possess something so extraordinary in her very cells. But looking at Faith's perfect, tiny face, Diane saw not a medical miracle, but simply her daughter, one of 3 precious gifts she would protect with everything she had. The program, she said finally, looking up at Rebecca and Dr. Gibson, tell me more about how it works. As they began discussing details, Diane felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. Her children's unique genetics might help save lives, but more importantly, they would grow up knowing they were more than just their genetic code, they were survivors like their mother, and their story was just beginning. What Diane didn't know then was that within 5 years, research based on her children's genetic profile would lead to breakthrough treatments for 3 previously untreatable autoimmune conditions. The Maxwell triplets, as they became known in medical literature, their real identities protected, would inspire a new generation of genetic researchers. But more importantly, they would grow into happy, healthy children, surrounded by a fierce extended family that included a former FBI agent, a dedicated deputy, and a grandmother figure who made the world's best chocolate chip cookies. And Richard, he never saw his children again. From his prison cell, he would occasionally catch glimpses of medical journal headlines about revolutionary immune therapy breakthroughs, never knowing he had come so close to controlling something truly priceless, not for its monetary value, but for its potential to help others. It was perhaps the most fitting punishment of all. 6 months later, Diane stood in the kitchen of her new home, watching the sunrise through large windows that overlooked a peaceful suburban street. The house, provided through the NIH program, was everything she could have wanted for her growing family, spacious, secure, and within walking distance of one of the country's premier medical research facilities. The baby monitor on the counter crackled with Christopher's morning babbles, soon joined by his sister's happy sounds. At 6 months old, the triplets were thriving, hitting all their developmental milestones right on schedule. Despite their unique genetic makeup, they were in every other way perfectly normal babies. Good morning, my little miracles, Diane cooed as she entered the nursery. The room, painted in soft yellows and greens, was filled with morning light. Each baby had their own crib, but Diane had noticed they slept better when arranged so they could see each other. Jean, the most outgoing of the 3, immediately raised her arm to be picked up. The doorbell rang just as Diane was finishing the morning feeding routine. Through the security camera, she saw Fabiana's familiar figure waiting on the porch, carrying her signature basket of fresh-baked muffins. The elderly nurse had relocated to be near them, taking a part-time position at the research facility's pediatric unit. There's my precious ones, Fabiana beamed as she entered, immediately taking Faith from Diane's arms. And how is our mama doing this morning? Diane smiled, adjusting Christopher on her hip. Better, the nightmares are less frequent now. She didn't need to explain further. Fabiana understood the trauma of those terrifying days in the forest hadn't disappeared overnight, but with therapy and support, Diane was healing. Dr. Gibson called this morning, Diane added, moving to prepare coffee. They've identified another family with a similar genetic profile in Sweden. They're flying in next week to discuss participating in the research program. Fabiana nodded approvingly. It's remarkable how much progress they've made since you joined the program. And speaking of progress, She gave Diane a knowing look. Louis mentioned he's being transferred to the local police department. Diane felt her cheeks warm. The deputy had become a constant presence in their lives, his protective instincts extending far beyond his professional duties. His weekly visits for security updates had gradually evolved into family dinners and long conversations after the babies were asleep. He's been a good friend, Diane said carefully, but Fabiana's knowing smile didn't waver. Friends are important, the older woman agreed, especially friends who look at you the way that young man does when you're not watching. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the back door. Rebecca entered, using her security code, dressed casually today instead of her usual FBI attire. "Sorry I'm early," she said, accepting a coffee mug from Diane, "but I wanted to discuss something before the research team arrives." Diane recognized the serious note in her voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Rebecca assured her quickly, "but we've had some interesting developments. Remember how we thought Richard's organization had sold their research data to multiple parties?" She pulled out her tablet, bringing up some documents. "We've identified most of the buyers, but there's one that stands out, a legitimate medical research foundation that had no idea about the illegal origins of the data. They want to make things right," she continued. "They're offering to establish a trust fund for the triplets' education and future medical needs, completely no strings attached, administered through an independent third party." Diane sat down slowly, processing this information. "You verified everything?" Rebecca nodded thoroughly. "It's clean money, Diane, and it could give your children options. We never had the best schools, college, maybe even medical school if they follow in their mother's footsteps." "Their mother, the dropout," Diane said ruefully, thinking of her interrupted nursing education. "About that," Fabiana interjected, "the hospital where I work part-time has a program for working parents finishing their degrees. The research facility would adjust your schedule to accommodate classes." She trailed off as Diane stared at her. "What, just because I'm retired doesn't mean I can't pull some strings?" Diane looked around at these women who had become her family, Fabiana with her practical wisdom, Rebecca with her fierce protectiveness, and felt overwhelming gratitude. Then she looked at her babies, now playing contentedly on their activity mat. Jean was trying to reach a toy just beyond her grasp, her face set with determination. Faith was watching her sister intently, while Christopher seemed fascinated by his own toes. "They deserve every opportunity," Diane said finally, "but more than that, they deserve to grow up knowing they're more than their genetics. They're not research subjects or medical breakthroughs, they're children, my children." Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "And that's exactly why you're the perfect person to guide them through this.